What happened to the San Diego cop who shot unarmed Fridoon Nehad last year? Not much. The Chargers play defense as their stadium proposal receives some negative reviews. And will more money ease traffic congestion in San Diego? We fact-checked that idea. I'm Mark Sauer. The Roundtable starts now. Welcome to our discussion of the week's top stories. I'm Mark Sauer. And joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today, reporter Andrew Keats of Voice of San Diego. Hi, Andy.
How you doing, Mark?
Good to have you back. David Garrick, who covers city government for the San Diego Union-Tribune. Hi, David.
Hi, Mark.
And reporter Maya Shrishkinen of Voice of San Diego. Hi, Maya.
Hi, Mark.
Well, a lone officer responds to a report of a man with a knife, and within seconds, the man is shot dead. Turns out he was holding a pen, not a knife, and the incident was captured on surveillance cameras. Weeks after the fatal shooting, the officer was back on patrol with the district attorney finding the shooting justifiable. Andy, start with this incident itself. Who was the victim? Where was he? How did he come to be fatally shot by Officer Neil Browder?
So he was a guy named Fridoon Nehad. He was from Afghanistan. He had been in the country for a while. And he was mentally ill. There was a call placed to 911 saying that there was a man threatening people with a knife, and the officer Neil Browder responded. By the time he got there, he saw who he knew was the suspect in the alley, saw him holding something in his hand. Based on the call, presumed it was a knife. Turned out it wasn't a knife, but by that point he had already shot him.
Yeah, very quickly after exiting the car.
Yeah, it's about 5
five
seconds if you watch the video.
Okay. So we had the DA, Bonnie DeMonis, the police chief, the mayor, city council. They fought the release of this video, this police shooting, for a time. But how was it finally made public?
So it was an intervention by local media, basically. KPBS, Voice of San Diego, I think UT San Diego, or San Diego Union-Tribune as well, all intervened and compelled a judge to release it, and after the judge ruled to do so, Bonnie DeMonis did release it. So, at the time, though, she announced very shortly around that period that she was not going to press any criminal charges. Now, that's not necessarily that surprising. There's a pretty high bar to press criminal charges against an officer, and I think there's for good reason. I think people can kind of understand why that would be the case, which doesn't say anything about what might happen administratively within the department in terms of issuing any sort of discipline or retraining, or even just a written reprimand of some kind. And that's all stuff that usually happens behind the scenes that, based on California's very strong public records laws, we never really see. We never really understand what's going on behind the scenes there. In this case, we do, and it's a pretty unique situation because the family of Mr. Nehad is suing Officer Browder, and in that civil case, he sat down for a sworn deposition.
Now that's the news this week, and that's what your story focused on. And there were really some revelations in that deposition in this wrongful death suit, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think the biggest one is that according to Mr. Browder, he not only didn't receive any discipline, he didn't receive any criticism, he didn't receive any harsh discussion of which tactics he employed. In fact, he wasn't even interviewed by Internal Affairs. He wasn't interviewed by the district attorney. There's just a series of questions where the lawyer says, did anyone talk to you at any time about anything that happened at any point related to this shooting? And for every question, his answer is no. In fact, his annual review that year, it didn't even come up.
It didn't even mention it in his performance
No,
review.
it didn't even perform.
Now, right after the shooting, as will happen in any case, any shooting, police officer involved or not, you got homicide detectives involved, and they did talk to him at the time, and he had a lawyer present, and then a few days later. But this is separate, of course, from Internal Affairs, from the district attorney's investigators. As you say, they did not talk to him. Now, his story kind of changed a little bit initially, and then a few days later with the detectives.
So then when they did a walkthrough.
He being the officer, I'm sorry.
Yeah, the officer did a walkthrough at the scene with homicide investigators, and he had an attorney with him at that time. During that walkthrough, the homicide investigators asked him if he thought that that Mr. Nehad was carrying a knife, or if there was any other weapons present at the scene, and he said no. His lawyer immediately shut down the investigation and said, we'll talk about this later. And it was a few days later when he sat down with them again that he said, I thought Mr. Nehad had a knife. That's why I feared for my life.
Okay. Now, the officer did admit he didn't follow police procedure in some ways during the confrontation? What did he fail to do?
So there were a couple things. One was he didn't have his body camera on. So this was not captured on his body-worn camera. It was caught on surveillance from a nearby business. At the time, the city policy was you should have your camera turned on at the moment you make contact. Now that in part because of this instance, they reviewed that policy and said it's a little bit too much to ask somebody to turn that on at that late juncture. So now you're instructed to turn it on at the moment you respond to a call.
So you're pulling up the scene, you got the camera on.
Yeah, well before then. So you're dispatched. You turn it on now.
Okay.
So there's one thing that was not a strict adherence to policy. Another thing is he gets out of the car, and you can see this all in the video. He opens the door and he stands behind it for a second, and then he steps outside of the door, and that's where he's standing when he shoots him. And he says in his deposition that it's drilled into your head during your training in the academy that when you're making an enforcement contact, you keep that door between you and the suspect so that you have that extra layer of protection. So by his own statements in his sworn deposition, he didn't follow that academy training.
Okay, so again, though, no reprimand, performance review, internal affairs, none of this comes up here.
Yeah, and to demonstrate the extent to which there is a much lower bar for some sort of internal reprimand than there is for, say, a criminal prosecution, also what comes up in his deposition is that 20 years ago, again,
this is Officer Browder.
Officer Browder, he says this in the deposition. He was given a written reprimand by Internal Affairs. He was responding to a domestic violence call. The suspect started to resist, and they needed to restrain him. Officer Browder struck him twice with his baton, once in the stomach, once in the calf. And I bring that up not to suggest that this is a pattern of behavior or this is in any way consistent with something you would expect from somebody who commits a shooting, but just to say that in that instance, they gave him a written reprimand, and it was vague and nonspecific. It just said, you didn't use the right type of force. It didn't enumerate the policies that it broke. It just said, in our estimation, this is not the right way to have handled it. So while I want to recognize that things are not always a strict matter of black and white, and you might want to give law enforcement some deference to make some professional decisions when they're on the job, it's clear that Internal Affairs is willing to be a little bit vague and subjective.
David?
I'm interested in the body-worn camera part, because do we know if there are what the procedures are? Are there incentives to follow the rules or penalties if you don't? Because I think a lot of people look at the body-worn cameras as maybe a possible deterrent to police brutality.
Because you've got that record
but,
there, yeah.
But if the guys are going to not turn it on and then not get disciplined for having not turned it on, I mean, do we know what the policies are?
I don't know about any written policy in terms of what the specific penalties are, and it brings up a good point, which is when the department had some problems a couple years ago with Anthony Revelos and other officers. They commissioned a third-party review of the department's disciplinary policy from the PERF, the Police Enforcement Forum. I can't remember the name, but it was commissioned by the Department of Justice. Yeah. And the findings of that report were specifically that there were problems in terms of when discipline was administered, when supervisors raised red flags on officer behavior, following up on things like this, and basically that things were consistently falling through the cracks. So that being the case, I think what we hear about what happened behind the scenes in this case is interesting. And I think to your point, David, that so you have this policy that says when you're supposed to turn the camera on. Well, what are the consequences for not following that policy in that case?
When taxpayers are paying for these body-worn cameras and everyone looks at them as a possible solution, it seems like there should be a significant penalty if you fail to follow the procedure.
Yeah, and a pillar of trust, as it were, because you've got these officers and these cameras. We also have a Citizens Review Board in this city here, which relies heavily on the internal affairs investigation. But if you're not even going to talk to the officer, it doesn't seem like the Citizens Review Board is going to come into play much in this case.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point, because the Citizens Review Board makes policy recommendations. They don't punish particular officers. They make broad changes based on.
How can we do this better? How can we avoid an incident resulting in a
and they don't have
shooting?
Subpoena power. They can't go conduct their own investigation. They rely on Internal Affairs. So if the Internal Affairs review is flawed or incomplete or just lacks comprehensiveness in any way, then the ability for us to make changes to citywide policies is therefore obstructed.
Well, I know
as
some
well.
folks have lobbied to give them subpoena power, and maybe that would be at least a solution to part of this.
Right.
Yeah.
A couple seconds left. What's the status of the case? When might that civil case go to trial, or could settle, of course?
It's hard to say in terms of
long pipeline.
Some documents have been released recently. This was all in relation to basically a motion to include information months after this incident. Officer Browder accidentally discharged his weapon during a probation check and accidentally shot through a baby's crib. Luckily, no one was injured, no one was hurt at the time, but the civil attorneys failed to get that information included in the trial.
I see. Okay, all right. Well, we'll look for developments as we move along in that case. We're going to move on now. The Chargers are putting up a vigorous defense of their downtown stadium/convention center expansion, but it's a big task to convince 2/3 of voters to back their plan. Now there's some analysis to help voters decide, and it's not surprising that a firm hired by the team paints a pretty rosy picture of this, and rosier that is than the city's independent budget analyst or the County Taxpayers Association. So David, start by summarizing this Chargers proposal. I know we're going to get into the weeds on some numbers here, but help us out.
The Chargers proposed to raise hotel taxes from 12.5% to 16.5%. They argued that the hotel tax is too low in San Diego and that it's basically a subsidy for the hotel operators. It's lower than almost any other sort of tourist-friendly city.
So there's a revenue stream we can tap.
Exactly, and we'd be taxing out-of-towners, which, I mean, yes, if a couple has a fight and the husband goes and spends the night in a hotel room, okay. But for the most part, hotels are for out-of-towners, so that's another positive. In their view, and it would generate $1.15 billion in revenue, and that would pay for a convention center annex combined with a stadium across the street from Petco Park downtown. The Chargers' contribution would be about $650 million, which would be from the NFL, the team, and then also selling personal seat licenses.
Okay, so we've got the city's independent budget analyst, Andrea Tevlin, and she says, how much more revenue does she say the hotel tax hike will generate? I mean, this is where it gets to be. The team is her numbers and theirs don't jive.
But I would think that I would point to Tevlin's analysis as probably the most important. I mean, that's debatable, but all the other ones you could argue that they have an agenda.
Somebody's got an agenda.
Right. I mean, you know, the hoteliers who are clearly against this raising of the tax, and also the convention center annex, they'd prefer to expand the convention center on the waterfront. They've been pretty adamant about that for years. So they commissioned a study, but you can pick on it, and I think it's fair to pick on it. It assumed that the convention center annex and the existing convention center would compete against each other, even though they both be run by the city. That seems like, you know, maybe a bad assumption. On the other hand, they pointed out that 3 similar facilities in St. Louis, Indianapolis, and Atlanta have all failed, all convadiums, which is a combination. So, I mean, you know, they made some good points and some bad points, but you could argue that they have an agenda. And you could argue the Chargers obviously have an agenda. They both sides say we picked an unbiased, you know, person, but Andrea Tevlin, I think we have
the city's IBA. There's your objective.
Pretty good confidence, and I think she felt like a key element is, does this tax increase raise enough revenue to pay for this project? Otherwise, it's kind of a non-starter, right? I mean, the big picture question is, do we want to raise hotel taxes to fund a stadium? And that's a question for everyone to decide. It's a value judgment.
And is it going to be successful if we do that?
Right, but if the proposal wouldn't even work, well, then you can't even get to the point where you're making the decision, should we be doing this? Should we be subsidizing the Chargers? Yes or no? Well, if the whole plan won't work, it's silly. Her argument was it would raise enough money based on their assumptions, but I'm worried that they may have underestimated some of the ancillary costs. Not for the structure, but they have to replace a Padres parking lot, they have to move the Metropolitan Transit System bus yard, and other things that might come up. The Chargers say they have a big enough cushion in there and that there's enough of an increase that it's covered. She says, based on their estimates of costs, it is, but what if their estimates of costs are wrong? All
right, we do have a bite here that goes to this. An expert in the IBA's office who's looked at all this, Jeff Kowar. Let's see what he said.
I'd say that, you know, there's just a lot of unknowns right now. There are plausible scenarios where it could pay for the cost of the project and pay for tourism marketing and still have some residual money for the city's general fund. But alternatively, there are also scenarios that we can't know with certainty now that would perhaps not have sufficient tax proceeds to cover the project as contemplated.
So again, the problem here is, what are these costs? It could be a lot more than what the teams say.
I think it could, but I think the Chargers would tell you in response to that is that they're going to have to sell bonds to generate the upfront capital to build this project, and then they would pay that back with the increased revenue from the higher hotel tax. And their argument would be is, if we go to the bond market and we show them a project that doesn't pencil out, well, we're not going to be able to sell bonds, or we're going to have to sell them at such a high interest rate where we won't generate enough capital. So I think they would argue that the backstop against these risks is that. A more key risk, I think, that some other groups have brought up is whether the city's general fund, that's its operating fund that pays for police and fire and parks and infrastructure, whether that is as vulnerable in this scenario. The chargers say absolutely it isn't. The bondholders would be taking the risk. And that's true, but some of the groups have pointed out that if the city is faced with having a municipal bond default, even though they're not legally obligated to do anything, arguably the city probably would cost them more money if they didn't come in and bail the thing out.
Because the bond rating takes a hit, and now they're having trouble borrowing and all. Let's get a bite here, and I know Andy wants to jump in on this. Let's get a bite from Fred Mass, who's the Chargers spokesman, see what he says.
We have absolutely no intention of ever drawing the general fund. We'll go through an ever rigorous financial risk analysis we have to after the election to make sure that happens. And if there's 1 cent of general fund money that's required for this project, we're not going to go forward.
All right, well, you heard that. What do you think of that?
I mean, I think, all these studies, and we do have a stack of these studies now that we can that people can pick and choose whatever conclusions they'd like from. I think David's point earlier is the right one, which is it's going to come down to a value judgment. Do you want this is a purchase? Do you want to spend this amount of money to purchase what is primarily going to be a football stadium? And are most voters going to do their due diligence and read all 3 of the studies that they have and compete?
Of course not.
And interrogate their assumptions? Right. Most likely not. And I think the prospects are still pretty tough. It's a 66% vote according to the city attorney. So it's going to be an uphill climb, and I really wonder whether these studies are going to ultimately be the thing that matters that much.
But I do think the intent of some of the groups who are against it is to say you can't even get to the value judgment question because there's all these other concerns. And the general fund one was also something that Tevlin brought up. She brought it up in a different way than the idea of the city protecting its bond rating, but she said, even though the Chargers' economic model includes 2 recessions, one as big as the Great Recession, and then one that was about similar to the 2011 post-2011 recession, she felt that was fair, but she argued that that's going to create swings in annual revenue. And so even if the entire enchilada is okay over 30 years, there may be a year or 2 in here, say 2008 or 9 in our world.
And what happens then?
And does the city then have to kick in?
Right.
And that seems like a legitimate thing to raise. I mean, I'm not an economist, but it made sense to me. And so I think that the opponent's goal is to get people thinking, I can't even get to the question of whether I want to raise hotel taxes, which may be a subsidy for the hoteliers. I can't even get to that to pay for a stadium because I'm worried that it's going to cost me money for firefighters and police.
And what are the taxpayers? Oh, go ahead, Maya.
Well, how many voters do you actually think are weighing that versus just saying, it'd be cool to keep a football team in town?
Right. It may boil down to that simple question.
The problem might be if they hear a soundbite on TV or someone like that says, hey, opponent group says it's going to cost you firefighters, and that's all they hear. That could be someone who might have voted yes, who might end up voting no based on a limited amount of information that the opposition groups have tried to put out there.
Right.
Yeah, and it's an interesting point because all this discrepancy about what happens with the general fund, it was a year ago that the mayor put forward his plan, which paid for it entirely out of the general fund. There was no hotel tax increase. The entire selling point was that we wouldn't have to increase taxes, and all of the money would come out of the fund that otherwise goes to police and fire. But I will say that to Maya's point about whether it's just going to come down to whether you want the Chargers to stay or go.
Got emotional feeling.
That is certainly the case that the Chargers are trying to make at this point. They got some flack for USA Today did a story about a social media campaign they ran trying to blame City Councilman Chris Cate and said, why does Chris Cate want the Chargers to leave? Call and ask him. And they got a lot of attention about why they're being mean, why they're going on the attack. But it is interesting that the message implicit in there is this vote is a referendum on the simple question, do you want the Chargers to stay or go? And I think that is increasingly the message we'll see from the Chargers over the next few months, is that this isn't a question about hotel taxes and revenue projections and hotel room nights. It's a question of, do you want the Chargers to stay or go?
Well, and we'll see if we can get to that big 2/3 number here. A lot more to come on that between now and Election Day. Well, we're going to move on. Speaking of another election issue, a half-cent hike in sales tax doesn't sound like much, but it would generate more than $300 million annually while promising what every commuter dreams of, traffic congestion relief. But will it really? Here's what Councilman Todd Gloria said about the measure when the San Diego Association of Governments voted to put it on the ballot.
From my perspective, it means more trolley lines, more bus lines, more bike lanes, and these are what my constituents want to see and will be possible if this measure is adopted in November.
All right, Maya, Todd Gloria talks about some of the things it'll accomplish. What else is in there in this whole package?
Well, as he pointed out, I mean, the measure is going to raise more than $18 billion over the next 40 years. A little over 40% of that is going to go to public transit projects, and about 3% of it will go to bike lanes and for pedestrian infrastructure and things like that. And we will get things like the new Purple Line from San Ysidro to Kearny Mesa and things like that. About 14% will go to highways. There won't be any highway expansions, but they'll be adding carpool lanes and connectors and
taking
things
care
like
of
that.
bottleneck problems that exist now, and creating
Yeah.
new bottlenecks also probably.
It's likely. And then 30% will go to individual cities so that they can deal with their local infrastructure issues, which can range from road repairs to stormwater projects.
Okay. All right, now your story this week was a fact check, a good old let's take a hard look at this. Now, relieving traffic congestion, how does it say it's going to do that, and what did you find?
Well, so in the ballot language, it very clearly says that one of the things that this measure will do is relieve traffic congestion. And SANDAG, the agency that puts forth the measure, is claiming that they will do that by adding carpool lanes, by adding public transit, and so they'll be taking people off the road, they'll be giving them other options. And they're also planning on clearing up some bottlenecks. So, for example, in intersections where there are trolleys and cars crossing, they would clean that up so it'd be a little more efficient. I found that lots of governments all over the country make that promise very frequently, and it's never really been shown to be true. And basically, the more space you create on roads, the more people are going to use them. So even if there are more people using your public transit, there'll still be more people who will go to fill up that extra space on the road once it's made.
And you pointed out in your story that SANDAG kind of thinks of traffic relief differently than most of us sitting there crawling along bumper to bumper.
Yes, they do. So their goal is basically to not make it worse. So they want to keep, right now, rush hour is from, say, 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. or something like that, or 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. At night. And they want to keep it at that and not extend it to like 3 p.m. to 8 p.m. or something like that. In Los Angeles, there are certain highways that are congested for like 4 hours or the entire day. They want to prevent that. And they have acknowledged that because our region is growing and there are more people who are going to be coming here in the next 50 years, that it's impossible to actually get fewer people on the road. But what they'll do is they'll keep it from getting worse, which I think most voters, when they go and look at this, aren't going to be thinking about.
Well, let's talk about the public transit side, even bicycles and other means of getting around or commuting. How bad would it have to get in your research here? How bad the congestion or the cost of sitting in traffic and the time before people really will go to the effort to go to an alternative public transit?
I don't know what the exact price is or what the exact time would be, but I mean, you would ultimately have to put a price on congestion, and you would have to see how much people are willing to pay before they go to other alternatives. And obviously having other alternatives makes that price lower and lower.
I think adding the Purple Line, I think, will make commuting by trolley. The Purple Line runs from Kearny Mesa to San Ysidro. I mean, it's just on maps right now, but it someday might be built, and if this measure passes, the odds of it being built more quickly go way up. So it just seems like there are folks who would like to commute by trolley who can't, just because of the way the structure of the system doesn't fit with their life. And I admit, it's not mass transit out on the West Coast is not as popular as it is in some eastern cities, but I feel like if your commute is extreme and there's this very convenient way, if you live in Kearny Mesa or you live near the border or somewhere along that route, I mean, I think this might encourage a chunk of folks to get out of their cars, and isn't it all about incremental successes? I mean, I don't think there's just one day everyone wakes up and goes, I'm going to commute. I think it's slowly and steady.
Well, so, Andy, we're going to
go ahead.
So, I mean, it does give people more options. And certainly if you look at SANDAG's projections, more people will start using public transit if there's more public transit going to more places where they want to go. But the thing is that won't, if you still decide to get in your car and go from point A to point B during rush hour, whether there's more public transit or not isn't necessarily going to change that in the long run, because our region is growing, so there are more people who will get on the roads. And then there are people who...
Wouldn't the percentage, I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you, wouldn't the percentage of people, I mean, if we have, another 50% more people, but there's the same number of folks on the roads, then theoretically we've won because there's those extra 50% are all in mass transit.
Well, that depends on how you think of congestion.
Okay.
I mean, that's basically taking Sandeg's point of view, which is it's not getting worse. But that's actually not changing your commute time.
Right, but if the population of the county is going to increase by 50%, I think we can all say if they do nothing, commute times are going to get worse. So if we do this, I guess they maybe stay the same.
All right. We're just about out of time. I did want to ask you or emphasize, what's the level on vote on this for this to pass, this half cent?
They would need 2/3.
2/3, so it's just like the Chargers. And any polling been done on this at all?
Well, yes, there has been some polling, and that's actually how they selected a lot of the language.
All right, we're going to have to end it there. We'll have more between now and the election, I'm sure. Well, that does wrap up another week of stories on the KPBS Roundtable. I'd like to thank my guests, Andrew Keats of Voice of San Diego, David Garrick of the San Diego Union Tribune, and Maya Sri Krishnan of Voice of San Diego as well. A reminder, all of the stories we discussed today are available on our website, kpbs.org. I'm Mark Sauer. Thanks for joining us today on the Roundtable.